Tucker Carlson is a disgrace with his conspiracy theories. In fact, Fox News in general is just a disgrace.
He preys on the weak. He preys on the people who cannot think for themselves. He preys on the people that have not been educated in forms of English that manipulate others. Yeah, I'm sick of it. He's the master manipulator, and I'm done. Fuck Tucker Carlson.
Tucker Carlson, I've met you. I know you're not a tough macho guy. I can't imagine you defending this country out in the battlefield. And I know plenty of women who have done that for us with great nobility and great courage. For shame on you, Tucker Carlson. This is not a job that you would do.
My name is Donna D'Onofrio from Brigantine, New Jersey. He is a misogynistic, racist, entitled frat boy who has been a mouthpiece for Trump's big lie about election fraud. And I would love to see Tucker Carlson attend boot camp with any female in our armed forces. That won't happen because he's never served a day of his entitled life in any service to our country.
This is for Tucker, and I just wanted to let him know that the TVs on the Italian base are being turned off when his show comes on. So hopefully that will happen around this country too. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Patsy. I am an American citizen. I am of Russian, Polish, Lithuanian, Jewish descent, and I'd just like to say to Tucker Carlson, what's your problem? Like, why are you dividing our nation so much? Do you enjoy the attention just for the sake of attention?
Welcome to LPTV's We're Speaking. I'm Maya May.
And I'm Lisa Senecal. Every Wednesday, we're speaking with you about the most pressing issues facing our country by lifting up the voices of women working to shine a light on these issues and make real, lasting change and progress.
Tonight's show is about the ongoing battle for voting rights, but we don't do the show in a vacuum. And like so many of you, we are doing our jobs while grappling with the misogynistic and racially motivated killings of 6 Asian women in Atlanta. And I'm really having a tough time dealing with it right now. The way it's been handled, both in the media and by the sheriff's department, for example, using the shooter's words and not his actions as a motive and saying, well, he was just having a bad day and this is about his sex addiction. Lisa and I were talking about this earlier. This to me is, it's clear racism, it's clear misogyny, and the fact that they would take his word and then use that to build a narrative around it is incredibly frustrating for me.
Yeah, to take what he claims his motivation was, his sex addiction, but then for the police spokesman to come out and say that, he was just really at his wit's end. He'd reached the end of his rope. He had a bad day and this was the result. Like, he had a bad day. There are dead women as a result of what he did. This thing didn't happen to him. He did it. And it is such a white supremacist, arrogant, narrow view that this guy could stand there and say that. And then I was really pretty shocked that nobody followed up with a question calling him out on it. Because when I heard it, I almost fell out of my chair.
Yeah, and this idea that somehow we're going to accept the narrative that let's say it is sex addiction, that, okay, so a man feels these women have power over him, so the natural response is to eliminate them, to kill them. And we're not going to have that discussion immediately. No, that discussion has to be had.
Yeah, it does. And we're going to be talking a little later about Tucker Carlson. And one of the things that really struck me about today was, and stuff we've been hearing for the last couple of weeks, all of this stuff, all of this misogyny is on a continuum. And I know people are going to object to me saying this, but it's true. The member of Congress who calls AOC a fucking bitch, when Ron Johnson says that the Proud Boys are good people who are law-abiding, or Tucker Carlson goes after women in the military, or Trump says, a certain woman isn't attractive enough for him to rape. This is all a continuum that creates an environment where a guy thinks he can hold women responsible for his sexual impulses, and he can annihilate them as a cure for himself. And that's somehow acceptable.
Yeah, I mean, we're living in a clear culture of misogyny, and it's overwhelming. In previous shows, guests have shared strategies on how to deal with complex trauma, because these are truly layers and layers of trauma, and we're all trying to remain effective during these times. And it's why the Why We're Speaking community is so important, because we support each other with information and strategies to create progress, because with progress, there is always resistance.
Yep, there always is. So we are going to take a moment to take a quick break, take a couple deep breaths, and we're going to come back with a couple of your thoughts on Tucker Carlson.
I would like to speak to Tucker Carlson. I believe that with one hand tied behind her back, Senator Duckworth could kick his ass. Have a nice day, Tucker.
Tucker, who hurt you? You come from a very wealthy family. You yourself have claimed that you have more money than you know what to do with and don't have to work. And yet you talk about the liberal elites. Really? Do your kids even talk to you? Do they like you? Do they hate you? Please seek therapy.
I'm a veteran. And every single lady that I served with would eat him for lunch, march off, and never look back over their shoulder. He is so pathetic. He should really, really just get the out of media.
And I love our viewers. I love that you're
Hard to
sharing
argue
your
with any
thoughts.
of that.
No, certainly cannot. And, right now, politicians and companies that support them, I'm looking at you, Delta, are attacking free and fair elections, pushing legislation that makes it harder to vote. That's not just resistance, that's an attack on our democracy, and it's offensive. So this week, we're talking voter suppression, who's trying to suppress votes, how they're doing it, why they're doing it, what's at stake if they pull it off, and how we put the brakes on that.
Yeah, and it should come as no surprise that the party that wants to excuse a violent insurrection that many of them helped to incite is all in on the ultimate in anti-democratic tactics, denying people the right to vote. When you hear politicians talking about restoring trust in our elections or ensuring election integrity, let's remember that Republicans spent months leading up to the 2020 election undermining voter confidence, especially confidence in mail-in voting, which, by the way, was a really dumb thing for Republicans to have done because they were the big mail-in voters. And they topped it all off with pushing the big lie that Joe Biden is not our legitimate president. They're telling you, you no longer live in a democracy. And that's really dangerous. And they are really dangerous.
Yes, incredibly so. And we have two extremely accomplished women to talk us through all of this tonight. First, we are speaking with Donna Ladd. She's the co-founder and editor of both the Jackson Free Press and the statewide Mississippi Free Press.
Yeah, we're also going to be speaking with Dr. Andra Gillespie. She's a political scientist and the director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute at Emory University in Atlanta.
And we are, Republicans have mounted their most egregious attack on American democracy since January 6th. We asked all of y'all for your comments on that. What does it say about the GOP when they introduced 263 voter suppression bills in 43 states? And you all chimed in. Michael Harn tweeted us saying, I am tempted to quit the party. However, part of me wants to stay to persuade the silent, sane Republicans to regain control, not just for the GOP, but for the country.
We've gotten a
we'd
lot
love
of
to hear.
Sorry.
No, yes, we have gotten a lot of responses, and we love hearing from everybody. So you can give us a ring at 646-374-8339 and leave us a voicemail. We play them on the show, as you can see, and you can also tweet us using hashtag We're Speaking or leave a comment for us on Facebook.
And Facebook, you guys always come through for us. Kate Ryan writes that she's furious about their strategy and says, the question I have is, what are good people going to do to counteract this attack on democracy? What initiatives will be put in place to increase or aid those who need voter ID, to amp up those 80 million who did not vote in 2020 and other years, to affect the rules so the playing field is level? This calls for a bipartisan solution. Bipartisanship, Kate, I love your optimism. I'm really glad you mentioned that. I need that shot of optimism every once in a while because I'll admit I sometimes can't hang on to it.
Yeah, reach it across the aisle. Tough. The aisle feels very wide right now.
Yes, it does. I'm really excited now to welcome our first guest onto the show tonight. Donna Ladd is a writer, journalist, and editor who writes about racism, whiteness, poverty, gender, violence, and the criminal justice system. She's a contributor to The Guardian and was the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the Jackson Free Press, and recently co-founded the nonprofit statewide Mississippi Free Press. Welcome to We're Speaking, Donna. We're really excited to have you here tonight.
And I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I was saying to you before the show, you're the perfect guest for us to be speaking with, because you do have the criminal justice background and covering those kind of stories and doing those investigations, and certainly we're seeing the awfulness of what happened in Atlanta yesterday. But you've also been involved in covering elections and voting and voter rights for a long time. You were just part of the Mississippi Trusted Elections Project, which is related to your publication. Can you talk to us about what that is, what the purpose was, and what ended up coming out of that? What did it show?
Sure. Well, at the Mississippi Free Press, it turned a year old this week. So we've done a lot in a year. And one of the things that we did, thank you, is we got a grant to do the Mississippi Trusted Elections Project, which was what we decided to do is really kind of go at looking. One of the concerns in Mississippi for a long time, and I know it's true in other places, is that polling locations change a lot. And that makes it very easy to cheat, in the sense of if you don't, if people don't know where their polling location is, or it changes at the last minute, and then they have to go somewhere else, they end up in really long lines. They may just go home instead. And so what we found in the Trusted Elections Project is that there was no one place, imagine this, no one accurate place where you could find a list of all the precinct and polling locations in the state. There were some that thought there were, and then our Secretary of State had released a list of the polling locations for the state. We fact-checked them, and we had to do it. We had to use a lot of different methods to do it and a lot of late nights. But we figured out that there were, I think the number was something, 60,000 people in the state, and the state's not that large. 60,000 people can be a lot of people, right? Whose polling locations had moved without notice. And so on really the eve of the election, the Secretary of State, because of our reporting, had to fact check the list that he put out and put out a new list. Now, here's the thing that I find interesting about it in this conversation is that then he said it wasn't his fault. Well, it probably wasn't all his fault. The locals give them the information, but where does the buck stop to make sure that it's right?
Right.
And so I think there are a lot of, Mississippi, we're a real problem when it comes to all sorts of voting access issues, and always have been. But one of my messages is to have real trusted elections. We have to watch out for what's not the disorganization and the systemic breakdowns that then allow cheating, or just allow by default problems with voting. And a lot of times the problems with those polling locations fall in poorer or, as it were, majority Black areas. And so it can really affect the turnout. Sometimes you can't prove that it was on purpose. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but that's just one more way that that voting is affected. We had huge lines, and we know that at least part of that was because of people not having the right information.
So you mentioned that the shifting of the polling locations last minute, and I think in the case of Mississippi, was it the night before or 2 nights before that the actual ones were confirmed? So it was super last minute?
Yes, it was. I keep saying the eve of the election. It might have been 2 days, but it was just right then. And then there was, we did a big breaking story about Madison County, which is a county right outside of Jackson here, kind of known as a white flight county, although there are a lot of rural areas and such too. But a polling location was moved to a lot of the Black voters had to go and vote in a kitchen in this really nice apartment complex. So they're crammed in a kitchen with all the polling machines on top of a kitchen bar. We have photos of that.
Wow.
And it was ridiculous, but it was just in lines around the block, and they had no parking. These are all voter access issues too. What
Right.
we're looking at, and we don't usually pay attention to it until the next election rolls around. So that was the kind of thing we were really looking at in the project itself.
And do you find that, because so it is affecting the Black voters more often, and so is there an incentive then to get organized? Because I'm seeing like this cluster of trying to, and they can blame it on bureaucracy. They can say, oh, well, you know what, the buck doesn't stop here, as you said. And so where is the incentive to ensure that or are there ways to incentivize to ensure that everybody has equal access to these polling locations?
Well, that's something that we're working on now. We're going into part 2 of the project. Because our biggest fear and what we know happens in Mississippi is that nobody pays any attention to it for 2 years or 4 years, whatever the problems are. They get busy doing other things. And even the good people, it's like there's so much to do. And so you're not ready for it. And then here we go again. I mean, we think that these lists were so bad from years and years and years of just bad information getting through without anybody doing anything about it. So, yes, I think that as our role at the Mississippi Free Press, which is statewide, we have to keep that heat on about it. We can't let up either. And so that's one of our goals now, is to get another round of funding and do the part B of this, which is what needs to happen to keep this cleaned up. And how do we keep that in front of people so that they're really paying attention? Because especially right now, y'all are talking about 43 states where just these crazy laws, crazy Mississippi type laws are happening. So people have plenty to worry about. So they might not be worried about polling locations in Mississippi, or anywhere else, but we should be.
And it sounds like there's an awful lot of what could kindly be called misplaced concern. Folks saying that, we're really, really worried about voter integrity. We want to be able to reinstill trust that the voters have in the legitimacy, the outcome of elections. It's not really a legitimate concern, and it's certainly not what Black voters are most concerned about. Can you talk to us about how that is being sort of put out there to confuse?
Sure. Well, here's the thing. I grew up in Mississippi. I've heard this stuff all my life. I call that Mississippi logic in many ways, because we've used it. So the powerful here, that whether they were the Democrats and the Dixiecrats in the 60s, and a real mix of people who couldn't figure out their party for a long time, or the extremists in the Republican Party now, that's very Mississippi. And a lot of people want to look down on Mississippi. At least we know it, and we're trying to do something about it here on the ground. But what I would say to the rest of the country right now is don't buy that so easily, especially if there's no evidence for it. Like we covered a whole big voter ID push, which happened here in 2011, I think. And that was the logic then: voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud. But there was no evidence of widespread voter fraud. But we still, 63%, they put it to a vote, 63% of Mississippians voted for it because they believe that. Now, here's the thing, and I'm not in the mood to not say this out loud these days. We're sitting here having similar problems in a water crisis that's driven by racism. The truth is, those are racist excuses. I can't even call them dog whistling. It's very intentional to make it sound like Black people, Black leaders are incompetent, or like in the case of running our water systems and taking care of them, or in the case of voting, those people, want to steal the election. I sat here in January, and and after the elections, and watch from Mississippi as this kind of rhetoric that we are working hard, at least a lot of us here in Mississippi, to educate our neighbors about these lies that we've been told since, the lynchings and race massacres after the Civil War that were done to keep Black people from voting intentionally. And so these are not things that we should buy into. The integrity is not believing stereotypes about people and not believing that these problems are there without evidence. The integrity ought to be in making sure it's as easy as possible for people to vote, especially during a pandemic, but otherwise, and if, you got to watch out for problems, and you got to have systems in there to take care of the problems, of course. But this idea that there are all these shadowy people out there stealing elections and committing voter fraud in some podunk town in Mississippi is just absurd. So that's what I say about integrity.
Well, and I like that you called it out, because that's so important, because disinformation, misinformation, it's very purposeful these days. And I think sometimes we want to believe that people don't have these evil, intentions when they're doing it. And they do. And until we name it, and name it over and over again, because it is easy to forget, or it is easy to push to the side, or it is easy to allow them to control the conversation. And the conversation then does become about they should get the ID, and they should do this, and why aren't they doing this? Right. And the fact is, Black people have been jumping through hoops to vote for decades. And so It's not like we're not putting in the work to do it. It's just the obstacles keep coming.
Well, and I think one of the things that's worrisome too is I do think that there is a population of people out there who are just miseducated. And our leaders should not be in the business of miseducating. Mississippi's leaders have always been in the business of miseducating through our textbooks, through lies, through every possible thing that they could do. And so, so if you've got people who, can believe the logic of, we need to show an ID so that nobody steals, tries to vote when they're not supposed to. I think dealing with that straight on with evidence about how that just doesn't happen very often, to me is more useful to deal with people like that, to deal with logic, but to also name the racism. Does that make sense? It's like, I'm not saying that every person who voted for voter ID was being explicitly or intentionally racist. However, that their leaders are telling them to be, through this kind of rhetoric. And yes, I absolutely think that's evil, and so I think the conversations need to be focused on the evidence and the truth, right? And that they're trying to fool you, and that's absurd. Our democracy should depend on, at the very least, access to vote. And like in our case, we don't have any kind of early voting, or we have absentee, most basic. And you have to get 2 notaries to cast an absentee ballot in our state.
Insane.
For the ballot and the envelope. I stress out over trying to get a notary for some business document. Oh, how do I do this, and where do I go? Much less somebody with transportation issues and all these other things. I mean, that we just got to call out the emperor without any clothes there about who's doing what, because that's naked, as we would say here.
Yeah, it is.
It is naked.
Completely without clothes.
That's right. What you're doing there is just that you are just trying. You're desperate when you're doing that. And I don't make it about party. I mean, that's not my thing. I'm not a big party person. But all of our leaders right now in the statewide leaders are one party. And all of our leaders in the state of Mississippi should be for the kinds of voting integrity that is helping as many people vote as possible. That's integrity.
Yeah.
And not using these scare tactics. And that's the same thing that ought to be happening across the country. And again, people like to look down on Mississippi, but stop acting like you want to be Mississippi in these 43 states by doing this stuff.
Right. This is not something you want to take Mississippi's leadership on.
No.
And it's time. It's beyond time that we stopped. We just have one more minute, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to weigh in on the murders that happened in Atlanta yesterday. You've done a lot of work on in criminal justice investigations and race, and you had a tweet today. Can you talk to us where you saw white supremacy and privilege coming into
places. Yeah. But the reason that I tweeted that one, I know what you're talking about. The sheriff. Okay. The sheriff coming on camera and sharing that the white man who killed these people was said he was having a bad day. Come on. I mean, that's the thing. It's like, and then there are excuses I've been seeing people on Twitter make. Oh, well, it wasn't, whatever, making it, that's not white supremacy. It's white supremacist to not understand why you don't say that. That is a privileged white man thing happening there. If you don't have any clue about what is going on in this country over policing and racism and just violence against women and all these other things, you don't say that. And that was not an evidence-based thing. That's something the guy said to you. Talk to us about what evidence y'all have,
Right.
But don't come out and share his feelings with us. I mean, that is just, that's like the, whatever the poor white guy on steroids problem, when you have the sheriff sitting there saying that. And I saw it and I was like, Maya, I was just like, immediately just blowing up. I'm like, this is just, I cannot believe. I knew there wouldn't be good stuff out there, but for that to happen, that is just so horrifying. And these law enforcement leaders need to study, just like everybody else. White people are born into white supremacy. And what I like to say to people is that what that means is that we automatically benefit from it. And what we have to do is we have to do the work to remove it from our lives, right? It's like to remove the beliefs and all those other things. And so that's what I'd say to that sheriff. It's like, that was not okay. And if you don't understand why it wasn't okay, then that is a symptom of white supremacy. Because, and a symptom of someone who does not belong in a leadership position.
Exactly.
No, and certainly with a microphone. I mean, that's just, that was absurd.
Absolutely.
And they wouldn't say that about people of color. They just wouldn't. They wouldn't come out and start talking about somebody having a bad day. One of the things I tweeted is like, who's having a good day when they're out massacring people? I mean, that's who cares what he said about his day,
Right.
That was absurd. So
yeah. It sure was. Well, I appreciate you sharing your perspective on this and everything on Mississippi and the voter laws and the way that we really are being influenced in other states now. It should not be spreading. So thank you for holding folks accountable, for having the Mississippi Free Press. Independent journalism is so important, and God, keep doing it because we need you more than ever. Thank you very much, Donna, for being with us.
Yeah,
You're
thanks,
welcome.
Donna. It was really great chatting with you.
So much for having me.
Thanks.
Thanks. That was super informative, and I think people got a glimpse into just how sinister these voter suppression tactics can be. And, the GOP tactics really boiled down to three things: eliminate, frustrate, and intimidate. Since they're playing games, Lisa, we were talking about this. We thought we'd play a little game too.
Yeah, we're going to have a game of our own. It is called Cards Against Voters. So this is kind of amazing that we have to be even having these conversations or making jokes about it, but there's a lot to learn about it. Learning can be a little dry, so we're going to play a game, and hopefully we'll all be a little better informed by the time we get to the end of it.
Yes. You can play along with us. Everybody who is watching on YouTube, Facebook, this is the time to learn, get educated about these things, and be better armed when you have conversations about this stuff with friends and family in the future. So our first card is stricter voter ID laws. Stricter voter ID laws. So is that tactic to intimidate, frustrate, or eliminate? What do you think?
Eliminate.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a little of everything, but I would imagine people are finding it really, really frustrating. There are so many different ways that these ID laws are really insidious. It's one of those things that sounds like it makes so much sense. It's just common, like, doesn't everybody have an ID? Why wouldn't you just show an ID when you go to the polls? Well, no, everybody doesn't have an ID. And there are real barriers to getting IDs for different populations. And surprise, those populations happen to be overwhelmingly people of color.
Yep. Yeah. And this ID, some people don't have driver's licenses because they don't drive, or even having a birth certificate. Well, a lot of older Black Americans, there is no actual official birth certificate. It's records kept in the family Bible. And so this, when you're talking about, some of us think, oh, it's ease of access. I can just open up my folder and I have, a utility bill. Well, what if somebody doesn't have a utility bill in their name? So there are so many ways that this creates, and nobody likes paperwork. So we're talking about levels upon levels of frustration that have been created by systemic racism. Yeah,
it's
money. Yes, exactly.
When you get a driver's license, it's not free. When you have to get a copy of a birth certificate, it's not free. When you have to take time off from work to be able to go and do this stuff, it's not free. And they're all intentional barriers put in the way of voter access it's a solution looking for a problem, because we don't have problems with people not showing ID and committing fraud. It's not a thing.
That's it. Yeah. So, the answer to that one is frustrate. So, stricter voter ID laws, it is to frustrate. There it is.
Yeah. Our second one, limiting mail-in, early, evening, and weekend voting. Frustrate, eliminate, intimidate.
I'm going to go with eliminate on this one. Eliminating options. It's like they're not making it easier to vote, they're making it harder. And why? What's the reasoning behind that?
Yeah. There's not, that's what's so frustrating about so many of these. There aren't good reasons for this. Limiting voting on the weekends, part of the reason that is getting eliminated is because on Sundays, it has been a tradition for a very long time to do Souls for the Polls, where folks in the Black churches go directly from Sunday service to the polls. And if you eliminate voting on Sundays, you eliminate Souls to the Polls. If you cut back on the hours that people are able to go and vote, a lot of folks who have lower incomes work in jobs where they don't have flexibility. So they don't get to get out of work on election day and go vote during the day and then go back to work. And some of them can't, even if you have extended voting, you can't get out of work early enough to ever get to the polls if they're not open on the weekends or in the evening.
Yeah. And a lot of people who work office jobs, white collar jobs, their companies will give them, the time off, PTO, to be able to go and vote. Well, people of color aren't as represented in office jobs as we are in other jobs. And so again, this all of this has racist undertones. So this one, eliminate.
Yeah, surprise,
Definitely
the answer
eliminate.
again. Racism. And as you said, the answer to this one is eliminate. We're just eliminating opportunities for people to get their ballots turned in. Next one, Maya.
Card number 3, we have moving and reducing number of polling sites, early mail-in voting, ballot drop locations, and drop boxes. Ooh, this is a complex one. This is compounding. We talked.
Yeah, I'll guess this definitely frustrates. I'm probably
if we don't know where the polling
too.
stations are, right? Like if the polling stations keep moving, if it's not accurate, if you go to look up the information and 2 days before it's one thing, and then the day before, who has time to check 3, 4, 5 times to make sure they're going to the right place?
Right. And when they start reducing the number of polling places or reducing the number of drop boxes, there's one reason that happens. It's not because drop boxes are expensive or they can't budget for the polling places. It's because it makes it more difficult for people to be able to access them. And it has the dual benefit of creating really long lines on election day. If you're not able to find ways to drop off your ballot early, then you get to stand in long lines. And we'll talk in a minute about a problem that folks in the long lines are facing. So the answer to this one is?
Got it. It's eliminate and frustrate.
And frustrate.
Yeah. Yep, it's those two.
Yeah, our next one, card number 4, is voter roll purges. Eliminate, frustrate, intimidate. What do you think?
This one gets me. This one really gets me because this idea, so the reason they'll purge voters who haven't, for example, voted in the last 2 elections, and they'll just go ahead and purge them, not notify them that they're being purged, not take into account that maybe there's a reason why they didn't vote. They just out and out. So somebody might go to vote and not even realize that all the work that they did to register to vote, to make sure that they had all the documentation that they needed, that they can't vote because they've been purged from the rolls. That's insane. That's frustrating.
Right. And it's such a coincidence that so many of the states that are big on voter roll purges are the states that have a history of Black voter disenfranchisement. It's, it shouldn't be surprising any of us that this is happening. So we'll go on. Oh, sorry. And so the answer to that one is, I almost jumped right past.
Yeah,
this one is
frustrate and eliminate. Double whammy.
Yeah.
Yep. And we got the next card, felony conviction exclusion. Oh, okay. So felons can't vote in many states.
Yeah, this one is so, I mean, they're all incredibly disgusting, but the reason there are so many more people of color who have felony convictions is that our criminal justice system is incredibly inequitable. And if you're a person of color, especially a Black man, for things that a white person might be either have reduced to a misdemeanor or just, don't do it again, a Black guy will get charged with a felony. And so we're creating additional felony convictions. And then when people have served their time, we are making it difficult and impossible to be able to get their voting rights back again afterwards.
Yeah, and just even this idea that one should lose their ability to participate in society because they've committed a crime after they've paid their debt to society, because that's the whole point of prison, right, is to rehabilitate people so that they can rejoin society. So the fact that they can't participate then in the system, and then even, some states are saying, okay, well, fine, you have to pay back your fines then before. Well, we all know that the income earning potential of a recently incarcerated person is not that high to pay those fines. So, so this is to me, this one's meant to frustrate and to intimidate. That's my answer to that card. Let's see if we're right here. Yep, frustrate and
You are
intimidate.
right.
Yep.
And our final one, voter intimidation, the inhospitable polling sites. Frustrate, intimidate, eliminate.
Yeah, all of the above. All of the above.
Yeah. Yeah, all the above. We were talking before about the inhospitable long lines. There are states that are actually trying to, and Georgia's one of them, trying to make it illegal for people to be able to give water and food to people who are standing in ridiculously long lines that are created in the first place because they are eliminating polling places and drop boxes and trying to make it more difficult to vote by mail. So the lines get longer, and then you can't provide support to folks who are standing in these lines. And that's not happening in white precincts. That's happening where Black people are trying to vote. And, we're going to do everything we possibly can to make it as uncomfortable as possible. So hopefully you will leave and decide not to vote, or you'll see those lines on TV and never show up in the first place.
Yeah. Frustrating, intimidating, eliminating, all of that. It is all of the above. And, we put this together so that we could have some shared language around discussing this, because this is something that we are going to have to continue to talk about and shed light on. So you have played our first edition of Cards Against Voting with us, and we'll definitely we'll have to bring it back. Yeah.
Yeah. We need to bring a round of Cards Against Democracy, and we'll see if we can't get some folks, some viewers in playing with us the next time. It would be a lot of fun to hear how incredibly educated you already are on all the tactics that the Republicans are going at this next 2 years.
So we are going to go to break really quickly, and then we're going to come back with our next guest. Or we have later in the show coming up pretty soon, Dr. Andra Gillespie.
While you are sleeping, Republicans across the country are attempting to turn Trump's MAGA nastiness into the law. Bills that would dramatically impact access to your constitutional rights to a ballot. Laws that would restrict vote by mail. Even make giving water to those waiting in line to vote illegal. Why? Why would Republicans make this the spine of their party? They said it in front of the Supreme Court of the United States. The only way they can combat the Democrats' voting advantage is to play dirty. Politics is a zero-sum game. Because that's what this is to them. A game. While you work, while you pray, while you fight for your families, the fight for democracy goes on.
This message is for Tucker Carlson and everyone at Fox News. How dare you insult people of color, our men and women that serve in our military? How dare you? Matter of fact, your name is Sucker Carlson, and you should be banned from television altogether. So Tucker Carlson, you, Donald Trump, Lou Dobbs, Sean Hannity, Laura Ingraham, Roger Stone, Michael Flynn, Paul Manafort, all of you guys need to share a holding self. The Republican Party has done nothing for the last 4 to 5 years, and I'm sick and tired of seeing my fellow Americans get the short end of the stick because you guys want to keep everything like Jim Crow. You guys want to keep everything old-fashioned. Give me a break. Sucker Carlson, you are a disgrace.
Well, that's the perfect segue into our next segment. It is that time. We are going to do this week's Oh, for Fuck's Sake Award. Each week, we like to take a few minutes to shine a spotlight on a few folks whose actions have really just completely exceeded our expectations. They've truly outdone themselves in being deceitful, dishonest, and anti-democratic. And we give them an award for it, our Oh, for Fuck's Sake Award. It's our way of saying, you're horrible, and we see you. Folks, here are this week's nominees.
Back in our nominee list is the senior senator from Russia. I'm sorry, did I say Russia? I meant Wisconsin. Ron Johnson. Ron has had quite a week. In addition to the intelligence community exposing him for laundering Russian election disinformation, Ron also claimed that the nearly all-white insurrectionist crowd that invaded the Capitol, murdered a police officer, and injured more than 100 others were just people who love this country, that truly respect law enforcement, would never do anything to break the law. What would have worried QAnon? If the insurrectionists had been Black Lives Matter supporters or Antifa. For those without a racist decoder ring, that's white supremacist for Black people.
Yeah. And next up is everybody's favorite, Tucker Carlson. We've all come to know Tucker as a nonstop faux white outrage generator. He's a misogynistic man baby, but he's recently distinguished himself as a COVID anti-vaxxer, a Russian propagandist, seems really popular with conservatives these days. And add to that, Tucker's now anti-armed services. Well, that is if you're a woman. Tucker doesn't want to hide his sexism or racism. He gleefully attacked pregnant women serving in the military and women in the military in general. And then, keeping true to form, played the victim when he was called out for it by people who, unlike Tucker, actually served their country. The only wars Tucker fights in are his manufactured culture wars, and he's on the side of trying to destroy our democracy.
Hard to beat that. Our final nominee, Sarah Huckabee Sanders. She's back, y'all. She's super excited that Individual One surprised her by showing up at her campaign event at Mar-a-Lago. Yeah, you heard that right. Sarah's running for governor of Arkansas and using campaign donations to hold her event at Trump's club/illegal residence. Why wouldn't he show up to support a candidate who endlessly lied for him while in office and is now funneling campaign contributions to his property?
Yeah, and there's still time to vote for your least favorite in the Offs poll this week, along with 9,000 other people who've already weighed in. The poll is still live on our Twitter at LPTV. We'll announce the winner of the losers at the end of the show. Still ahead is political scientist Dr. Andra Gillespie, but first, a message from the Lincoln Project. And we've got some questions for corporations, too.
I did not serve in the military. Obviously, Tucker Carlson did not, but I will tell you who did. My 84-year-old mother and my 84-year-old father. And my mother at 84 has more integrity and patriotism and honor in her little finger than Tucker Carlson could ever dream of having. And for Tucker Carlson and people like him to degrade the contributions of women in all aspects, not just the military, in every walk of life, women have added to our nation and its progress is just appalling.
In the 1960s, powerful white politicians tried to stop Black Americans from voting. With Jim Crow laws, with fire hoses and dogs. Today, the new Jim Crow caucus is going further. They are trying to throw out millions of black voters. Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz, Ron Johnson, Kevin McCarthy. It's a new dark chapter in American history. Any corporation or individual who contributes to the Jim Crow caucus is supporting racism at the highest level. It's a choice. Which side of the Edmund Pettus Bridge do you stand on? America or the Jim Crow Caucus.
The Lincoln Project is responsible for the content of this advertising.
Yeah, these folks we saw in that last segment, guys like Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz, Ron Johnson, they don't do this without corporate money behind them. And so we want to call out some of the folks who are still out there giving donations to these seditionists. We'll start with in the state of Pennsylvania. Crown Holdings, $250,000, Lincoln National, $41K, U.S. Steel, $28K, and Rite Aid, $26K. It's got to stop.
And looking at Ohio next, Marathon Petroleum with $336,000, Huntington Bank Shares $66,000, Procter and Gamble $45,000.
Yeah, Florida. Seriously, L3 Harris Technologies, $374,000 that you're putting in the pockets of seditionists to continue what they're doing. CSX, $131,000. Next Era Energy, $103K, and Publix, Publix supermarkets, $102,000.
And Georgia, Delta Airlines, $236,000. Not flying Delta, nope. And Norfolk Southern, $159,000. So, yeah, they can't do it without the money. So we have to put the pressure on them. We have to put the pressure on the corporations.
Yeah, we do. They need to be held accountable for what they're doing with their money. These folks all make money off all Americans, without the American public, and that includes everyone. That's Democrats, Republicans, people of all races. That you are backing seditionists with your dollars has to stop. We're going to be right back with Dr. Gillespie after just a couple messages.
This is in response to your Facebook post about the Republicans trying to cheat their way into the next elections. LOL. It is pathetic and despicable what they're doing, and it will not be allowed to stand. This is America, and we get one vote for each eligible person, and they can make it as hard as they like. As long as they're not bringing out the dogs and the fire hoses, trust and believe, we're going to vote. Make sure you stay vote woke and fight voter suppression nationally.
Colombian woman, an immigrant. My parents worked very hard in this country to help us make a better life. And both my brother and I, we have lived here since 1969. And to hear and to know what these people are doing to try to suppress our votes and to try to silence our voices is devastating. I am devastated and just so saddened and disheartened to see that their mission is just to really just take control of this country with white supremacists and racists and bigots basically at the helm, disempowering all of us people that are brown and black that don't look just like they do.
Truly sobering. And that's why I'm glad that we have with us tonight Dr. Andra Gillespie, political scientist and director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute of Emory University. She teaches courses on race, politics, and elections in the United States, new Black political leadership, and political participation. In short, she's the perfect person to speak with tonight. Welcome to We're Speaking.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. Seriously, this is a conversation that's going to be ongoing. The first thing I want to address, really, because you are in Georgia, so you're seeing the shifts in Georgia. Can you talk a little bit about like the margins that we're seeing and how voter turnout is going to affect what those margins look like going into the future?
Yeah, so Georgia has actually been undergoing a demographic shift for the last 20 years in the state. So in the 2000s, we saw the African-American population grow. People call it the reverse migration, and we saw the Black electorate grow in the state. The proportion of Blacks who are registered voters in the state has stayed relatively stable. over the course of the last decade at about 30%. But we've seen a doubling of Asian American and Hispanic voters in the last 10 years that reflects population shifts. And so with 30% of the state's voters being African American, with another 6% of voters being Asian American or Hispanic, and with Georgia having a larger share of white Democratic voters. I mean, most white voters in Georgia are still overwhelmingly Republican, but we've got more Democratic leaning voters in Georgia than say we do in neighboring states. With the right turnout combination, Democrats are actually more competitive. And what we've seen happen in the last decade was that activists realized this demographic shift was happening, that it was likely going to favor the Democratic Party. And they have made it their business to go out and register voters who weren't previously registered, and then to educate them to get them to turn out to vote. So what we saw happen in 2020 was the culmination of years of effort. And if we look back at the number of, or what the margins look like in statewide elections for the previous decade, those margins had been narrowing over time. So, in the mid 2000s, George W. Bush won the state of Georgia handily in his presidential elections. Sonny Perdue and Nathan Deal won their elections pretty handily by double-digit margins. But those margins had started to shrink to high single-digit margins, and they'd started to get closer even before we got to the 2020 election result. So it was only a matter of time before Democrats were going to be able to pull off an election victory. This doesn't mean that Democrats are going to win every election going forward. I wouldn't say that without a few more years of election data to pull together. But what it suggests is that Georgia's demographics are competitive. Races are going to be decided by very narrow margins, and we shouldn't be surprised if we see Democrats and Republicans making really important statewide victories in the next decade.
That makes all of these bills that are being proposed to change the rules around voting all the more important, because those margins are so thin right now. And seeing those trends happen has obviously been really motivating for folks on the other side to find ways to keep especially Black folks from coming out in larger numbers, getting registered to vote. What do you see the impact of these restrictive voting laws doing, and how much could that set Georgia back if they go through?
Yeah, so I think it's important to understand what voter suppression is and what it's not. So voter suppression is suppression, one, based on whether or not it's intentional, and then whether or not it actually has the effect of reducing voter turnout disproportionately for certain groups, particularly people of color, over others. And so if we think about this like a 2x2 table, there could be intentionally suppressive tactics that don't actually materialize in the intended effect, or that do. Or you could have things that are policies that weren't intended to be suppressive that end up having a disparate effect on protected classes, or that don't. So the only one of those four quadrants that really isn't voter suppression is the stuff that wasn't intentional and that doesn't have an impact on voting. So if something wasn't intended to be voter suppression, but yet we're seeing disparities in voter turnout that we can attribute to this particular policy, it's suppressive and it needs to be addressed. And similarly, if something was intended to be suppressive, but it turns out that it wasn't because people outsmarted the system, right? We're not going to sort of reward the people who created this nefarious policy with saying that they get a pass because people proved to be resilient and figured out how to get around that. That's not appropriate either. And so we have to look at intention, motivation, and put that into the context of the history of voter disenfranchisement in this country and in this state in particular. And then we also have to look at what the effects are. And so oftentimes people are so hung up on trying to find the smoking gun. I think part of the reason why that lawyer felt very comfortable in saying that he was trying to not give Democrats an advantage before the Supreme Court was because he said party, right? Party's not a protected class, but race is. But race and party are highly correlated with one another. So I can't separate the two of them out. So just because you didn't say it doesn't mean that I'm not going to look at the wider historical context, the origins of these laws, and call foul on it. And even if it doesn't work, that doesn't mean that it wasn't intended to be suppressive. And therefore, we also need to combat it as well, because motives are really important here.
I love the shift in the conversation around this because it's clear that everybody's getting savvier about calling it out. And so the fact that he felt comfortable saying it was almost like he didn't expect to be called out on it. And then he was. You talk about resilience and that's really important to me. And, the role of the Black church, predates really voting itself. And can you talk about how the resilience of the Black community and the different obstacles that we've had to face and kind of how the church has evolved in its role?
Yeah. So let me end with kind of the big takeaway. Just because Black people have proved to be resilient despite hundreds of years of racism and oppression doesn't mean that it's okay to oppress people. Just stop. End of story. Yeah. Just because we will figure out a way to get around it, or the way that you could stretch a dime to a dollar doesn't mean that the inequalities or the systemic problems that people are pointing out aren't real and don't need to be addressed. In terms of the role of the African American church, it's played a very pivotal role in one, helping to secure voting rights for African Americans, and then also helping people in terms of their civic preparation. And sometimes it's ways that are intentional and also unintentional. So we could talk about the role of Black pastors in leading civil rights movements. One of the reasons why they were able to do that was they had a natural position of leadership in their communities. And then also, especially once we get into the 20th century, this wasn't the case in the 19th century after slavery, or even in the early part of the 20th century, was that these were the people who were economically independent. There were some people who, because of the fact that they worked for white people, were more beholden and might not have been able to take a leadership position without risk of losing their jobs. Pastors who were being employed by Black congregations were in a position to be able to take stances. That's part of the reason why you see the Southern Christian Leadership Conference taking such a pivotal role in the long civil rights movement in the mid 20th century. But, there are things that people hadn't really pointed out before that I don't think we think about a lot. African Americans have learned civic skills as a result of church participation. And the political scientists Sid Verba, Kay Lehman Schwarzman, and Henry Brady noted that African Americans who participated in church acquired civic skills that they may not have gotten because of an unequal education system that actually were easily translatable into the public sphere. So if you didn't get a good civics education in your school because maybe you didn't finish, or because things weren't offered in Black schools that were offered in white schools, you maybe learned that by participating in church. And we know from other work from people like Fred Harris, for instance, that Blacks who participate in church activities are more likely to participate in civic activities like voting. So this is a really important place where skills are learned. People can learn things in church that they may not have the opportunity to learn in other places because of deprivation. But most importantly, we've seen churches continue to play a pivotal role in social justice movements and in civic engagement movements. And so whether it is members of the clergy running for office and winning, so we could look at people like, former Congressman Calvin Butts or Floyd Flake or Senator Raphael Warnock, or even Adam Clayton Powell, the first Black congressman from New York in the mid part of the 20th century, right? We've seen ways that ministers have played an important role, and ministers who aren't going to run for office still continue to play an important role when they bring elected officials to their congregations to speak to them, and also when they engage in mobilization activities like Souls to the Polls.
We are living in a country right now that our demographics are shifting, and it is inevitable that probably in a little more than 20 years, we are going to be a majority minority country, which seems to freak a lot of people out and be the source of an awful lot of what's going on right now. But the tactic, instead of trying to appeal to a larger group of people, to find ways of speaking to different communities, the tactic seems to be, we're just going to try to find ways to keep those folks from voting. That isn't a democracy anymore. So what is it that people who are trying to disenfranchise voters on the scale that it's going to be necessary, what's that system of government that they're really trying to create in the United States? Because it's not a democracy.
Well, you know what? I mean, some of my colleagues would actually argue that America didn't become a full-fledged democracy until the Voting Rights Act was passed, and all Americans, regardless of their color, received full voting rights, because there were Blacks who were walking around who didn't have full citizenship rights because of Jim Crow. They may have had it on paper based on the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, but the 15th Amendment wasn't operational for nearly 100 years in the United States. And so I think we need to recognize that democracy is a process, that we must be vigilant to preserve democracy, and that when people take dangerous efforts to undercut democracy for short-term political gain, they risk long-term institutional damage. So people are worried about, I don't recognize my country anymore, right? If people start to diminish voting rights now, what that means is that in the future, we may not have a democracy to defend. So you are opening yourself up to authoritarian regimes and other dangerous ideologies where people will in fact not be free. And some of the people who think that they would be free, in something like a white racial state, may find that they themselves would also not be free as well.
Yeah. And, none of this is to be taken lightly. I think these are discussions that we didn't realize that we were going to be having in 2021. And we now are having them. And you tweeted, I can't remember if it was today or yesterday, about Fox News' reporting on Columbia's graduation as being disingenuous. And, the level of misinformation and deliberate disinformation, can you talk about that and how that is playing out in this changing, in this voter suppression, but then also this new form of government, apparently, that they're trying to go for?
Yeah, so my concern about that Fox News article was the clickbait. So it's Columbia is holding separate graduations for identity groups. And the subtitle in smaller font was, okay, it looks like there's one sort of general graduation. So the first thing is that these identity graduations have been going on for years. I've been out of school longer than I care to admit. And I went to those. I almost went looking for my kente cloth from at least one of my Black graduation, ceremonies. So I remember going to the formal one for graduate school. And then I remember going to a special reception where I got special gifts. So my gifts are around here somewhere in my house. Those were happening and nobody was objecting to those. In the late 90s to the mid 2000s. But people are objecting to them now because people are going to get outraged, and they're not official graduations. Nobody confers a degree on you at the Black graduation ceremony or the Latinx graduation ceremony. These are graduation ceremonies that are culturally specific for groups who have felt like perhaps they were outsiders within these communities, and they found homes within these identity groups and support, and they want to celebrate with the people who actually helped them get through. And they are separate. They are, on the official calendars, but they are often put together by folks in the Dean of Students office, who are working with these students to help get them through school. They are not part of, they are not the official graduation ceremony where people receive their degrees. Trust me, I went to my main graduation ceremonies, and that was where I got to turn my tassel. And so to say otherwise or to imply that something else is going on when that's not true, or when you have a lot of reason to know that this is not true because these are very old, longstanding ceremonies, is something that I find really problematic. And what it's doing is it is feeding into this concept called confirmation bias, where people look for and take in information that confirms what they already think. And so for a group of consumers who's been fed sort of a steady diet of division and misinformation, all you're doing is kind of adding more fuel to the fire and taking and doing more damage than you are doing good. You're not taking the responsibility seriously to educate, to provide truthful information, to hold leaders accountable. So I don't know if they're trying to hold Columbia University's leadership accountable for having these separate ceremonies, right? I mean, is it really a problem? If Black students or Asian American students or first generation students want to have a ceremony where they can specifically say, I achieved this. People in this community were the ones who helped me get through. And I may have had it differently than other students who, were born into a lot of privilege. So I just find it really disheartening that people can't celebrate the accomplishments of others. Instead, they want to nitpick what they feel that they're excluded from, when most of the time they're holding most of the cards. And the truth is, you're not excluded from identity ceremonies. So, if you have been an ally and supportive of those communities, you would be more than welcome to come, right? And they're on the official calendar, which means anybody can attend. And if you're attending with good intentions and you're not there to be disruptive, nobody is going to say anything to you.
Yeah. Deliberate disinformation.
Confirmation bias. Yeah. There's so much of it. Confirmation bias is a really interesting thing to talk about. And we have so much of it now because it's really our steady diet of what we consume for news. Because our sources have become so fractured and we really are just looking to have our opinions echoed back to us. Do you, when you're talking to your students, what are those conversations like? Are they savvy enough to understand? I guess my question is there hope with the next generation that because they have grown up with digital media and social media, do they get it more than people my age and older who are just being sucked under?
I don't know. I would have to do a little bit more research to answer that question in particular. I know how I teach media and politics has changed over the last couple of years because of the environment that we're in. One of the things that's interesting is my friend Kevin Arsenault and the late Martin Johnson did work sort of looking at how people double down on facts. So even when people watch news from opposing viewpoints, it actually tends to reinforce what you already think as opposed to helping you. And then there are a lot of people in the middle who aren't paying as much attention. And so we want people to sort of learn how to be, responsible consumers of news because it's a civic responsibility, right? When people aren't paying attention, that's when bad things can possibly happen. And so we need to take it as part of our responsibility as adults, as American citizens, to be aware of what's going on. You don't have to watch news 24/7, but the idea that you could go weeks without knowing what's happening in the world, there are laws that could be passed that could affect your life. That's probably not the smartest thing for you to do. What I find myself teaching my students is I don't test them to see sort of like where they are in terms of their media consumption. But one of the things that I do now is I tell them how to be smart consumers of news. So one of the things, I do is I go through an exercise where they read transcripts of Sunday morning talk shows so that they can see, and from different networks, so that they can see the similarities and the differences. And then also I make sure to teach them how to spot fake news and to give them general tips. Like if it's showing up in one source, but it's not showing up in all of the sources, chances are it's not true. And also when you're watching television news roundtables where they have different people, there are folks who are sitting in different positions. And you should be able to identify in political discussions like the designated Republican and the designated Democrat, and who's playing an analyst role. Are they a reporter? Are they an expert like a professor, who is coming, in and their goal is to be objective and to not really kind of come down the line from one partisan side or the other. I'm not sure that, students innately know this because they're digital natives. And in fact, they are learning about politics for the first time and really coming into their own as adult citizens. So I would expect that they still need that help and that they need to learn how to be, better consumers of information the same way that we all do.
That is incredibly helpful. We all need that course on how to spot fake news. I feel like that should run. We should all be able to take that class every day because we really need it. This has been incredible having you with us tonight. I definitely want you to come back because, again, this is information that we need to hear over and over again. And
the issue's not going away.
Yeah.
Nope. Not anytime soon.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And now we're just going to have a quick break, and then we're going to come back with our OFFS Awards.
I would just like to say that my mother joined the military right before she got pregnant with me. She served in the Gulf War, the first Gulf War in Desert Storm, where I had to go live with family members while she proudly served and protected our country. She had both myself and my brother while she was an active duty enlisted servicewoman, and she retired at the rank of major. How dare he ever condemn or
the little women in the military. She was the biggest role model of my life and did more to serve her country than Carlson ever did.
Yeah, it's time. You hear that and it's just like, Carlson, he's just like the gift that just keeps on giving. It's time to name the winner of this week's Oh For Fuck's Sake Award, given each week to the most insane, offensive, and dangerous character in politics. Our nominees were Ron Johnson, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, and Tucker Carlson. For those who didn't win, remember, it's a dishonor just to be nominated.
And it probably comes as a surprise to nobody that the winner of the losers this week is misogynistic man baby Tucker Swanson McNear Carlson. Tucker has spent decades honing his male victimhood and faux white outrage, which is nothing more than white supremacy. Even the white supremacists know it, and they love Tucker for it. His misogyny runs so deep that last week he even attacked women serving in the military. Apparently, supporting our troops ends for Tucker with supporting men who serve. And because Tucker clearly doesn't care how many people, including Fox viewers, die from COVID-19, he's become a COVID anti-vax evangelist. Yet another bit of Russian disinformation that Tuck spews. Tucker, you are anti-democratic, you're dangerous, you're depraved, and you are our oh for fuck's sake loser among losers this week. Congrats or something.
Tucker Carlson is never going to change, but the rest of us can work together. We sure can to push forward the change that we need. Here are a few things that you can do. You can give to organizations working to preserve and expand voting rights, the NAACP, Stacey Abrams Group. All of these are organizations that are working to ensure that people have equal access to elections. You can tell your elected officials that you're going to work against their reelection if they continue to support and not work to actively defeat voter disenfranchisement legislations. And very important, educate yourself on the issues of voter disenfranchisement. We played the game tonight, but learn more about what these attempts at voting integrity really are, ways to suppress minority and poor voters, and talk to your friends and family about these issues.
Yep. A good way to educate yourself is by watching The Breakdown. It's on tomorrow night at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 Pacific, with Tara Setmeyer and Rick Wilson, when their guest is going to be U.S. intelligence and terrorism expert and best-selling author Malcolm Nance.
I see that visceral rage in my fellow veterans that I haven't seen in ages. There's this true outrage at the idea that our nation that we fought so hard to defend, that we went overseas and wore a flag proudly on our shoulders as a beacon of hope, has devolved to a point where violence is now a part of the political spectrum.
Subscribe and listen to the latest episode of the Lincoln Project podcast with Reed Galen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and wherever podcasts are found.
And we will be back next Wednesday at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific on LPTV, the Lincoln Project's YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. And in the meantime, you can tweet us, leave us voicemail, send us text, Facebook, #WeAreSpeaking.
And next week, we're going to be speaking about violence that too many women face, including trans women, where they work, in public spaces, in the military, pretty much anywhere we go, and even don't go, because too many women, home isn't safe either. And it's become even less safe during the pandemic. People of all genders need to be talking about this. We're going to be talking about it because if women alone could have ended violence against women, we would have already done it a long time ago.
Exactly. So we will see you all next week. Good night.
Good night. Take care, everybody.
So often in life, things that you regard as an impediment turn out to be a great good fortune.
Men and women are persons of equal dignity, and they should count equally before the law.
The idea of a young girl aspiring to be a judge, even more Supreme Court justice, is a wonderful thing.
The notorious RBG.
Do you have some good advice you might share with us? Yes, I do.
Be someone who holds fast to her convictions and her self-respect.
Be independent. Don't be distracted by emotions like anger, envy, resentment. These just sap energy and waste time.
I am proud to nominate for Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg of the United States.
People ask me sometimes, when do you think it will be enough? When will there be enough women on the court? And my answer is, when there are 9.